So should I do the full screen now, or?
Not yet, not yet, Sean, because you will see a little button. You need to agree, and then.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the last presentation for the 2017 CUAHSI Cyberseminar series on the Hillslope hydrology and earth system models. Just wanted to let everyone know there will be a Q&A session after each presentation. And if you would like to ask a question, we ask you to raise your hand or type it into the chat box. And if you do raise your hand, we will unmute you. And if you do decide to talk on phone, we ask that you connect via phone versus your computer microphones, just for better audio connection. And so, Ying, did you want to add anything?
Yes, let me just briefly give everyone the structure of today's webinar. And first, we'll have Sean, Swenson, and Dave Lawrence from NCAR, the CLM working group, to talk about some of the work that has been going on the CLM to get ready to incorporate Hillslope hydrology. And then we will answer some questions and have some discussions pertaining to Sean's presentation. And then Martyn will provide a synthesis of the last 4 webinars, the presentations, the main ideas, and then the main discussions. We'll take some questions again, and then finally I will go over the outline of the synthesis paper, which really summarizes the outcome of all these 5 webinars and discussions. And with that, I think we'll have Sean's presentation, already on the screen.
Okay. Whoops. How's that? Is that working?
It looks fine. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, okay, so this talk is going to describe just some initial results, showing some of the progress we've made towards incorporating some of the Hillslope hydrology ideas into CLM5. And this is work I've done with Dave Lawrence, Justin Burkett, Martyn Clark, and Ying. Justin's done a lot of work looking at running the model in what we call single point mode at the Reynolds Creek location, and he's been writing up that work. But here I'm going to talk a little bit more about sort of an overview, looking at the global implementation. So CLM is the community land model, and it's part of the community earth system model, which is supported by NCAR. And so, let's see, you can see my little mouse. So the community earth system model is a tool that can be used to answer a wide variety of questions related to climate and the interactions of all the different components of the Earth system, from land atmosphere interactions, climate variability, climate change, etc. And so, jump in if I miss anything here. Yeah. And so as part of that, the terrestrial processes are governed by CLM. And so on this slide here, we have CLM, and then below that, the LMWG refers to the land model working group. So CLM is the model, the land model working group are the people that contribute to the model. And so within CLM, you have all these interactions between societal dimensions, that's basically talking about the human component, hydrology, ecology, biogeochemistry, and cryosphere. And what this project has been set up to look at are there ways in which the hydrology can be improved in CLM by drawing on the expertise of people in the hydrological community. But of course, this picture is meant to describe how this is all a two-way interaction. And so the benefit to the hydrological community is that CLM has fairly sophisticated descriptions of all these other components, ecology, biogeochemistry, the human interactions, etc. And so we can ask, how can the hydrology improve CLM? But then also by incorporating the hydrology into CLM, we can look at how, for example, climate change or how climate variability impacts the hydrology, or how the ecology and the hydrology interact within CLM. This is kind of our standard schematic of all the processes that are included in CLM. So, if you want to think of these as kind of the pillars of the model, hydrology is one of those pillars, but there's also the energy, the surface energy fluxes, and the biogeochemical cycles, and all three of these are coupled throughout the model. And so again, by improving the hydrology, it's not just for the sake of the hydrology, but also for how those couplings impact the other components of the model. Okay, so just to make a quick point, conceptually, we're aware of the fact that there's within a landscape, there's heterogeneity in a variety of processes. But of course, CLM in its standard version is just a vertical model, and it's simulating essentially the grid cell average sort of quantities. But there is an understanding that, for example, there's heterogeneity in terms of where vegetation is in the landscape. There's heterogeneity in how precipitation inputs are partitioned, in this case between, for example, surface runoff and infiltration. And there's there's a parameterization for what fraction of the landscape is saturated versus unsaturated. But all these things are implicit. And so part of this project is to look at how we might improve on that by explicitly representing some of these things. And so the first thing that we're looking at is how an explicit representation of the lateral subsurface flow properties can impact the simulation, and how that affects both directly the hydrology, but also, for example, the evaporation fluxes and interactions with vegetation and things like that. So CLM, like a lot of sort of large-scale models, has a hierarchy of data, starting with the grid cell, which is where the model would interact with the atmosphere. And that typically is sort of a rectilinear latitude longitude based disaggregation of the surface, but just as an aside, it doesn't have to be. It can also be an arbitrarily shaped grid cell. And then within a grid cell, you have these different land units where the one we're going to focus on is what's called the vegetated land unit, but there's also lake, urban centers, glacier, and crops. And so a particular grid cell can be tiled with all these different land units. So in the standard version of CLM, there's a single soil column. This is where the vertical discretization occurs. And so, for example, in CLM 5, we have 25 layers describing the upper roughly 8 meters of the Earth's surface. And then within a particular column, there are also what are called PFTs, so plant functional types. So different kinds of vegetation can share the resources within that column. So they can share water and nutrients. So for this project, for the Hillslope hydrology, what we wanted to do was to leverage the existing data structure, because implementing a new data structure or expanding it can be difficult from a software engineering perspective. But here we're essentially adding multiple columns within a particular land unit and coupling those columns together so that there's communication between the columns, and we can then we can pass water between the columns to represent the lateral subsurface flow. And these columns can all have different properties. They can have different soil depths, they can have different areas, and they can have different elevations, etc. Okay, so here's just an example of a single point model simulation. So this was pulled out, like as I said, Justin's been focusing heavily on the Reynolds Creek experimental watershed. And so here's a simulation looking at that location. These are contours. The y-axis is depth and the x-axis is time. And these are contours of water content as expressed as the fraction of saturation, where the red's being saturated, the blue's being unsaturated. And so this simulation, we have three-column hill slope with the upper two columns having a fairly shallow soil of 60 centimeters. So this would be the first column, this would be the second column. And then the final column, representing kind of the riparian zone, has a deeper soil depth. And so what you can see happens here is, for example, in the first year, you go from relatively wet conditions into the summer. There's drying that occurs. And so you see the effect of having a limited storage capacity. The upper column passes water when there's saturated conditions to the second column. And so these two columns look fairly similar because they have fairly similar characteristics. But you can see this black line here represents the water table. And so you can see shallower water tables because you're getting larger moisture inputs now because these are not independent columns. They're actually communicating with one another and passing moisture. And then finally you have the bottom of the hill representing the lowlands. And here you have a situation where you have a much larger storage capacity. And so this column is able to store some of the water that otherwise would be have gone to runoff in the upper from the upper columns, and that water is now available for evapotranspiration later in the summer. So here's just a comparison of the annual totals for the different columns. So if you focus on this, just on this first, each one of these is a different year. If you focus on this first year for the runoff, the blue to green show essentially the net runoff occurring for the different columns. And so the dark blue here is the upland column, and it's a net producer of runoff. You have a positive outflow from the column. And as you move to the lowland column, it becomes negative because you actually have more inputs than you do outputs. And so this is showing that the model is capturing the convergence of water in the lowlands, and more water is being input than is being output. And then the final two columns here, the white is showing the actual outflow from the lowland, and the purple is showing the observed annual runoff as measured by the weir at the catchment outlet. And so you can see this kind of behavior occurs most every year, and you can see that the model, if you compare the white and the purple, the model does a reasonable job of capturing the runoff that's observed there. So the bottom column is similar in that it shows the evapotranspiration. And again, if you focus on the first year, the main point here is just that because we have this convergence to the lowland column, which is the green column here, it can support much higher transpiration, essentially, than the upland columns, which have a limited storage capacity. And again, the purple shows the observations that come from a flux tower in the lowland part of the catchment. And again, it shows that the model is doing a reasonable job and that the larger values of evapotranspiration are what you would expect at the lowland location. As I said, the goal here is to demonstrate that this is working globally. So we did a sensitivity study where we applied the same three-column hill slope with the same characteristics, no spatial variability, everywhere over the globe, and ran the model. So it's really all this is meant to show is that it does work globally. And this is looking at June, July, August average evapotranspiration, comparing at the top the hill bottom evapotranspiration which is, as I said, receiving additional inputs of moisture now because we have this coupling between the columns, to the hill top, which does not have any additional inputs. And one of the key features is, if you look at the bottom plot, which shows the difference between the two, there's a couple of interesting features of the plot that come out. And so if you look over areas that have a lot of rainfall, or areas that have very little rainfall, so humid regions and arid regions, you don't see much difference. And that you might expect, because in the humid regions, you're essentially, you're not water limited. So having this coupling between columns and having this lateral flow doesn't really impact the latent heat fluxes. And in arid regions, there's not enough moisture to really supply a lot of lateral flow. But in these transition regions, you can see that there is an impact of having the lateral flow between the columns. And so essentially in the places where you have transitions from humid to arid regions, you can now support greater evapotranspiration during the dry season. Yeah, I guess that's it that I want to mention there. Okay, so now as I said, in that simulation, we had uniform Hillslope supplied globally everywhere, but that doesn't need to be the case. We can have spatially variable parameters for all these things. And so some of the key things that can go into the model, if you look at the lower left here, this just shows like an analytical description of a Hillslope that you might specify, and from that you can get information about, for example, in the upper left, you can have the elevation as a function of width and length, and the black lines here are showing just showing flow paths. So this might be how you would specify the boundaries of your catchment. You can also get information about the upper right here is showing the profile along the length axis, so showing height as a function of length. And in this case, you would have, it has some sort of curvature to it. And the lower right shows the plan view, showing the concavity associated with this particular shape. And then on the right-hand side of the panel, you can see just an example of what a divergent Hillslope might look like. And again, you can have different elevation along the length. You have different profile views and different plan views. You can have a more higher order description of what the across the Hillslope topography looks like. Okay, so then, essentially you have to distill this information down into something that the model can ingest. And so here's an example of what this would look like. So here's a showing in the upper left, for example, elevation as a function of the Hillslope length. So this would be a 350 meter Hillslope, and with 3 columns. And so you can pull out essentially the average elevation for each of the columns. And you can do the same thing for the upper right. You have width as a function of the Hillslope length. In this case, you have a converging width function where it goes from wider to more narrow at the outlet. The lower left shows the slope that you derive from the elevation, and the lower right would show the converging area that you would get from that. And so these are all the inputs that would go into CLM, and then you'd use these values to parameterize the lateral flow at each of these points. So so we have all that in the model, and that's all working. And Justin's been looking at, for example, the sensitivity now to some of these different parameters. And this, I'm not going to go into detail of this plot. This is just to show some examples of these sensitivity studies that he's been doing. So this is an example of comparing the bottom column to the uppermost column. And for example, this is looking at the y-axis transpiration changes versus runoff changes for changing one of the parameters related to the runoff, and you can see a nice relationship between the two as you move through parameter space. And the same thing on the right, looking at the elevation changes and how that impacts the simulation. And again, you can see a nice surface kind of moving through the parameter space, and so you can use the model to explore how all these things change as a function of the topographic influences. So everything that I discussed previously was just looking at examples and sensitivities for a single hill slope. And so that, even with a single hill slope, there's some sort of zero order questions you can ask, such as, does it matter? Do we need to model lateral flow? And presumably most hydrologists say yes, but we need to quantify those kind of things. But then we can start to ask questions. Well, how do we do that? How many? What kind of the number of columns, for example? How many columns do we need? What sort of configurations might we use? But as I said, the way that it's implemented now is there's quite a bit of flexibility, and so we can add multiple hill slopes, and so this example here is looking at we can have multiple hill slopes, and we can then look at things like having different radiation loads due to changes in aspect, changes in slope between the hill slopes. In the lower left, we can have hill slopes with different elevations, and so we can start to ask how does having differences in atmospheric forcing as a function of the elevation gradient affect the simulation. So there's a lot of different ways that the model can be configured to incorporate some of these ideas. So that's it. I just wanted to give kind of a high-level view of the progress that we've made, and to show that we essentially have a tool that people can start to use to add in their ideas, and the structure is there. It's ready to incorporate some of the new ideas and new processes that people want to look at how those interact in the Earth system context. So, as I mentioned, there's a need for input data. So we've had some of these previous seminars have looked at different ways to describe the landscape and how to pull out the information. Let's see. So yeah, so we have an initial version of code. It's up to date with the most recent sort of state-of-the-art version of CLM. That'll be released this fall, and that'll be available to be used. NCAR has a visitor program, so we have opportunities for people to come if they want for extended visits at NCAR to learn how to use the model and to interact with the community here. And then finally, I hope that that this stimulates a lot of kind of questions about what we could do with the model, and questions that could be asked. Some of these I touched on before, but how many columns per hill slope? How many hill slopes per grid cell? How do we take all of this, geomorphological data and implement it in the model? And what are the key features? What's sort of the minimum data that we need? One of the things we've been talking about already is covariance, and how do we deal with the fact that when we're no longer just looking at average quantities, it becomes important to realistically represent covariation in the landscape between, for example, vegetation or surface and subsurface properties. How to describe processes. So a simple example right now is you can parameterize lateral flow using Darcy's law. You can use a kinetic wave approximation, but there's a whole number of ways that you can describe some of these different processes. And so again, the model's right now a structure that different ways and kinds of parameterizations can be used to describe some of these things. And then finally, whenever you add we're essentially adding resolution to the model. We're going from a single column to, for example, 3 columns. Well, right there, we have potentially increased the model cost by a factor of 3. And so, we need to think about ways to make the model run efficiently. And so there's people that have been thinking about that, and those are also interesting questions that can be asked. And that's it. So, thank you.
No, that's good.
Questions for Sean?
If you have any questions, just raise your hand or just type it into the questions box down in the panel.
If we would rather hold the questions till the end, that is okay too. But if you have questions pertaining to Sean's presentation, this is a good time to ask.
It looks like Jonathan Buzan just has a comment on it. He says the results look promising. Many recent studies try to attribute heat waves and heat stress to soil moisture. Looking at the preliminary results, there might be some significant changes in how we interpret these previous studies.
Yep. Yeah, I think that touches on, one of the goals of this project is that by trying to incorporate and improve the hydrology within CLM, we're linking these different communities, and CLM has to offer the hydrological community this ability to answer questions and run experiments in this coupled mode with other aspects of their system that they might not have access to within a traditional hydrological model.
Steve Burgess, yeah, go ahead.
He has a comment. He says it might be instructive for you to examine the spatial distribution structure used in HSPF.
What is HSPF? Oh, Steve, maybe you can type in what is HSPF for us? Well, while we wait for that, I think we are at the point we need to move on to Martyn. And a lot of the discussions can be integrated later. They're all related. Martyn will next give a summary and a synthesis of the ideas we have been discussing.
So is there a way for me to share my screen?
Yeah, you hit the, there's a little play button at the top of your control panel, and you can hit that, the down arrow to show the screen that you want or the program that you want to show.
At the top of the control panel?
Yes. So there's a big play button that should be showing up on that control panel.
The orange?
You mean change a presenter?
He's a presenter. He's a presenter.
Yeah.
I made a presenter. So he just needs to either hit that little play button up top or pick the application you want to use to show your presentation.
I don't see the play button. Where is it?
It should be towards the top of the control panel.
Show my screen. The left one on the very top, Martyn, there are 4 buttons. The left one says show my screen, and then you can click on that, I suppose. Do you see that, Martyn?
No, I do not.
Okay, let me do this. I'm changing it. I'm trying to change it. No, I don't see your screen on this. Liz, what can you do to?
Can you show it, Ying, because you've got the presentation?
No, let me see where is show. Yeah, so my screen is blanked out for me. Liz, did you pass the screen to Martyn? Liz? Sorry about that, guys. The thing is, Martyn, I don't see you on the list of screen.
I've got myself as presenter.
I know, but so change the
presenter. I share my webcam, but not share my screen.
Yes. Liz, are you there?
If Liz can change it to you, then you can.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to change to me and show my screen, and then I'm going to change again. Okay, now I'm going to show you. Are you sure you want to make Martyn? Yes. Okay, now I try to do that. All right, Martyn. I did that, and did you get anything on your screen? I lost Liz. Where is Liz? Hello, Liz.
Well, why don't you just make yourself the presenter, Ying, and just walk through the presentation, and then I can talk.
This is really, really strange. Okay. You have not changed anything since then, right? Okay. This is really strange. I don't know what the CUAHSI synthesis. Okay. I am going to now change the presenter to my screen. I'm going to show my screen. Okay. And then, do you guys see my screen?
Yep.
Yeah.
How come oh, here's Liz. Okay. If you see my screen, I'm going to do this mode, slide mode, and then, okay, go ahead then, Martyn.
Okay. Do you want to just head to the next slide? Okay. So we wanted to talk through the previous presentations. If you just click through this, Ying, and we put these into different categories. So one category is where in the world is lateral flow an important control on the water balance? So this is the work that Alham and Jim presented on the Bedico analysis. And then there were a series of presentations and different webinars looking at different ways of representing topographic controls on hydrological processes and earth system models. John Volk showed his columns at various distances away from the stream. Peter Hazenberg and Zhubin Zheng provided their approach. Nate Cheney provided his approach, and Hurriya Jamik provided an approach as well. Andreas Hartmann and Thorsten Wagner talked about heterogeneity and recharge and representing deeper groundwater systems. Leo Flores and Jim McNamara talked about how slope and aspect can control hydrological processes. And John Pelletier talked about how we can build different geophysical data sets. So we thought it would be useful to go through those presentations just to remind us as to the breadth of research that was presented. Can we go to the next slide? So this is just a reminder of what Alham and Jim presented in terms of incorporating lateral flow into the Bedico framework, in terms of understanding how lateral flow affects the partitioning between of precipitation into ET and runoff. If we go to the next slide, we've got a number of people who talked about different ways of representing subgrid hill slopes within Earth system models. This is a figure from John Volk, which is similar in many respects to the other procedures that have been presented, where he's got a set of columns at various distances going upslope from the stream. and representing one-dimensional lateral flow along that conceptual hill slope. And in John's two-pager, he's included a number of equations that are necessary to explain those processes. If we go to the next slide, Peter Heisenberg and Zhubin Zeng talked about implementing Peter Troche's Hillslope-Boussinesq equation, Hillslope storage Boussinesq equation into an Earth system model. What they do is they represent lateral flow as a sinc term within Richard's equation, so that's how the lateral response and the vertical response is coupled. Then they're representing hill slopes, of different shapes. And in this example here, they're showing a trapezoidal hill slope, which provides capabilities to vary the slope and the divergence and convergence. If we go to the next slide, they've got different spatial organizations here, depending on the stream order. So they've got, in this example here, a first order hill slope going directly into the stream on the left here, in the bottom left, and then a higher order side slope feeding into the riparian zone. So that's one spatial organization. The way that Nate Cheney organized things is that he's got a hierarchical spatial organization where he's first defining the subgrid characteristic hill slopes. Using environmental data on the hand index, height above the nearest drainage, precipitation temperature, aspect, slope, etc., to define a set of hill slope properties, and using those properties in a k-means clustering algorithm to identify an ensemble of characteristic hill slopes. And then within those hill slopes, he discretizes the hill slopes based on the hill slope profile geometry. So he's discretizing each hill slope into height bands. So that's the same as the set of columns that John Volk presented in his presentation. Then based on those characteristic hill slopes and height bands, what Nate does is he's got a third step. If you can click forward, Ying, which is to define the intraband heterogeneity. So there's different geophysical attributes that we've got on saturated hydraulic conductivity, land cover, porosity, etc., that Nate can also use in a k-means clustering algorithm to represent the subgrid heterogeneity across each of the height bands. The fourth approach is from Huri Ajami. So Huri Ajami is also using a hierarchical organization of hill slopes. So she's starting with the atmospheric model domain, talking about delineating watersheds within that atmospheric model domain, disaggregating the watersheds into hydrologic response units, and then within each hydrological response units having equivalent cross-sections, these conceptual hill slopes to describe the lateral flow of water along a hill slope. And these equivalent cross-sections can be broken up into the alluvial flats, the foot slope, the mid slope, and the upslope, based on similar philosophy to Nate in many respects. It's based on a similar concept to the height above the nearest drainage metric. So those are kind of like the four different ways of describing subgrid hill slopes within an Earth system model, and we can see that there's a lot of similarities among those approaches, and they can all fairly easily be incorporated within the same analytical framework. If we go to the next slide, what Andreas Hartmann and Thorsten Wagner were interested in is representing heterogeneity and recharge. So they had a conceptual model of groundwater flow for different mountain ranges around Europe, or for different land cover types around Europe. Then if we go to the next slide, what they're talking about is deeper groundwater systems and how they can represent the heterogeneity and subsurface properties. And they're showing that provides a much better representation of recharge than the homogeneous type representation that's used in the current generation of land models. If we go to the next slide. This is from the presentation from Leho Flores and Jim McNamara, where they're asking the question, how does slope and aspect control hydrological processes? So they've got some motivational slides here showing the differences in vegetation on the top, snow, and vegetation on the bottom as well. And how aspect controls the evolution of the responses, on different hill slopes. And their next slide here, they're showing a specific example of the distribution of snow-covered days. So they're showing the relative frequency of snow-covered days is very, very different, as we'd expect, for the northeast slope and the southwest slope. That's what we're showing, that two different PDFs there on the right. This is very important in the mountains in Idaho, where they've done a lot of their work. It's also very important. The controls of slope and aspect are very, very important in permafrost environments. If we go to the next slide, this is just a reminder of some of the work provided by John to provide more global scale information on geophysical data sets. So if we step back and take all of that together, Sean just showed the hierarchical spatial organization of the community land model, where at the top level, it's typically been a grid cell, but there's capabilities for irregular spatial units. So the top level could be a river basin. That's broken up into land units. What we're interested in here in the first instance is the vegetated land unit. And as Sean showed, typically we've had one column in the vegetated land unit, but it's possible to have multiple columns. That's what we've implemented recently in the vegetated land unit, to have lateral flow among the columns in the vegetated land unit. And then for each column, we've got the plant functional types. So you should be able to see immediately when we contrast this spatial organization with the spatial organization that was presented by Nate Cheney. We can have multiple representative hill slopes within a vegetated land unit. We could just have one hill slope, but we could have many hill slopes. So that's Nate's characteristic hill slopes. The different columns represent the different bands, the elevation bands among the hill slope, and similar to Nate, these could be identified using the height above the nearest drainage index, and the plant functional types can represent the subgrid heterogeneity among each of the hill slope columns. Similarly, this maps onto the work that Huri Ajami showed with her equivalent cross sections, where the equivalent cross sections could represent the collection of columns, and we also see some similarities with what John Vogt presented. So when we're stepping back, there's a couple of immediate research needs that we've got. One is to develop and synthesize new global data sets on geophysical attributes and hill slope parameters. So this is a lot of the terrain analysis that Sean was talking about. So how do we take the geophysical data that we've got and extract meaningful terrain information that we can incorporate into a land system model? And the second, to define these equivalent cross sections, or the different hierarchical organization of hill slopes. And the second is, once we've got that data, is to evaluate different methods to discretize the grids and basins into hill slopes, columns, and plant functional types. So this relates to a lot with a lot of what Sean was talking about. How many hill slopes do we need per grid cell? How many columns do we need per hill slope? How do we describe the processes? How do we describe the lateral flow across columns? What are some of the most efficient ways to run the model, etc. You know, like a lot of questions there, and we're kind of lacking a controlled comparison of different approaches for spatial discretization and process representation. A key thing that relates to this, and this is getting into some of what Nate presented, relates to the covariability. Leo Flores and Jim McNamara talked about the impact of slope and aspect. You know, there's other things that affect things as well. And Nate showed one approach through k-means clustering as a way to represent that covariability in a quantitative way. So that's the slides that we have here, and maybe Ying, you can just transition to your presentation to show how all of the presentations up till now are being used to formulate the synthesis paper, or the next synthesis paper.
Okay, before we do that, there are a couple of questions. Thank you, Martyn, first. And that was a great summary of that's a lot of material to go through in 10 minutes. So there are a few questions here, few comments here that we didn't have a chance to read after Sean's talk. Those were, I think, pertaining to Sean's presentation as well. And so there's a comment from David Chandler. In many cold environments, surface runoff can occur through snow, soil, and immobile regolith. Are these flows separated or lumped? I think this pertains to Sean's presentation.
I'm not sure I understand exactly.
Yeah.
I can try to answer that. I think it's lumped. We're not separating the subsurface. If it's in the soil or it's in the snow. In the snow itself, it has flow, but in below the land surface, and we don't have this immobile regolith. We have soil, and we have soil sediment, and then bedrock. So there's a lot to be thought about here, and this is a very good question.
Well, there's two main flow paths, right? There's the surface runoff and the subsurface flow.
Yeah, the subsurface flow is integrated.
Yes, that's integrated. So there is the surface runoff, but we don't have the heterogeneity of flow paths that occurs in nature.
Okay, and then Steve Burgess wrote, HSPF is one of the most widely used models in environmental hydrologic practice. So sorry, I'm not familiar with that. And I think this again brings out a key point. There have been a lot of hydrologists working for decades developing efficient hydrologic models, and we probably should do a better job to really review these and not to forget, not to reinvent wheels. So I will, for one, check this out. The next one, did you conduct from beyond that? Did you conduct any sensitivity analysis to compare the impact surface, topographic versus subsurface properties in CLM simulation? Impact of surface versus subsurface properties. What do you?
Yeah, I mean, that's what Justin, so Justin right now is working on a manuscript where focusing on the Reynolds Creek catchment, he's done all sorts of, I just showed a single slide, but he's looked at a large number of parameters to look at. And so some of those were the topographic, just sort of looking at the hill slope shapes, but also looking at some of the subsurface properties, soil depth, some of the hydraulic properties. I don't know if you want to add to that, Justin. Yeah, vegetation impacts. That's where he's spent quite a bit of work, actually.
Right.
And I also will add, earlier in the process, we did sensitivity experiments where we forced the amount of the partitioning of water between surface and subsurface, and then looked at the impacts of that, which is more directly answering the question. So, yeah.
Okay, any questions for Martyn before I jump into the final part of today's webinar? All right, I can just go ahead then. Then we can still have the questions, have opportunity to ask questions later. Okay, as I said earlier, and we had a bunch of seminars now, and we talk about a lot of ideas, a lot of really, really interesting ideas. And this process has been really, really helpful because none of us can read everybody's paper and know what's going on. And this process really brought people together and proposed a lot of different approaches. And a lot of the ideas crystallized after this process. So I think the next thing going forward is for us to write these ideas in a very, very useful way, not just general discussions, but really a practical guidance for what to do next. Okay, so this is the way I think this paper can be structured. It's not the only way, and this is what we have so far and what's in my head. Okay, so we're going to start with the introduction. And of course, we have to start with the need to represent basic concepts of hydrologic processes, Hillslope processes in SMs. We'll have a lot to say that, so we need to lay this out. And then I was thinking the second paragraph is we discuss what we mean by Hillslope hydrology. And when you hear this word, you know, I think everybody has a different picture and different ideas what this is all about. And I think there is a need for us to focus, to really converge on some very basic aspects or basic elements of Hillslope hydrology, which is elevation differentiation within a large grid cell and the aspect differentiation within a large grid cell. These are directly relevant to the water and energy differentiation among patches within this grid cell. And so I think we know these are important wherever you have significant topographic relief. And so we can call this really the lowest of the low-hanging modeling fruits. We pretty much know how to do this, or pretty good idea compared to other things. And there are a lot of other problems and other sort of aspects of the Hillslope hydrology. And I think it helps at this point to save that to the last section on much needed research on the subsurface heterogeneity, which is a big issue. Many of the two-page contributions address this issue. And I agree that this is a really critical issue from macropores to geological provinces to CARs, and these are really important, but we are probably not ready yet to implement that in global models. We need to really sort that out, how to do that. But for now, what we know how to do is the elevation and aspect as organizing principles of Hillslope hydrology. And I think you may disagree, and then we can discuss this, but I think it is helpful for us to focus and to really define our scope. So this second paragraph is to define the scope of this paper, what we mean by Hillslope hydrology. And then the third paragraph, basically the structure of the paper. The paper can be structured around answers to these four questions. Where in the world is elevation aspect important? This is basically our first webinar. And the second, what are the meaningful ways to divide an ENSM grid into units, the hierarchical ways that Martyn is talking about, and all the alternative approaches. So this is the second question. This is our second webinar content, basically. And thirdly, what are the essential terrain analysis that we have not done and we should do in order to provide parameters and insights, and just insights, how things co-vary, for example, and where this is important. This all depends on the global scale terrain analysis. We are very familiar with our own little watershed Hillslopes, but globally, we have to step out. What are the essential global scale terrain analysis for the sole purpose of supporting Earth system models? We have not done that. And that's our third webinar. We had a really great ideas there as well. And the last question is the new research that is much needed from both sides, from the hydrology catchment Hillslope side of hydrology side, as well as the Earth system side, Earth system modeling perspective. And so what are the common were mutually beneficial research areas that we need to pursue? And this is where we also lay out the future. What are the pressing questions that some of the individual research community, research groups can address? We basically lay out some kind of blueprints on future analysis. Okay, so these 4 questions basically are the 4 sections that follow this intro. And so on the second, excuse me, section 2, where in the world is Hillslope hydrology important to large-scale material and energy cycles? And so we had a couple of presentations, and we didn't have a whole lot of time to explore this more fully. But just to think from the top of our head, terrain, right? From the terrain side, if we have strong topographic relief, then we will have elevation and aspect differentiation. And from the climate side, we also need to have dry or season dry climate. If water is not limiting, then this is not important. And excuse me again. And then the productivity, plants. Do we have thirsty plants? And for example, we have a lot of seasonal season dry forests in the southern hemisphere, in transitions from tropical rainforests to savannas, those critical transition zones that have a strong dry season, but yet plenty of wet season rain. So the productivity is filled into full bloom. So we have a lot of forests, a lot of biomass, and the productivity must be part of the picture. Of course, productivity is a consequence of the terrain and climate interactions and the hydrologic and biogeochemical interactions. But for now, we should think of the key drivers of this importance of Hillslope hydrology in altering the energy, water, carbon cycles. And so some combinations in the world, the combinations of these factors, terrain, climate, productivity, perhaps others, the combinations of those, various different combinations of those, will produce this space-time structure of water surplus and deficit and potential for redistribution. If you have wet season surplus and dry season deficit, and if you have upland surplus and dry and lowland deficit, and then this is where Hillslope hydrology will matter. And I think these are the kind of thoughts we need to think through carefully and then lay out what kind of global analysis are needed. Do we have a good global picture of where this is important? How do the terrain, climate, productivity combine, interact, intersect to create those checkerboards that you have places that this process, this Hillslope process, is critically important, and you have places that are not so important. And so I think this is an important global picture for us to have before we plunge into how to do the nitty-gritty details. Okay, what happened? I showed Martyn. Okay, and then we move on to the third section. Which is our second question. What are the meaningful ways to divide a grid into Hillslope units? And this is our basically our second webinar. We have a lot of ideas here, and I think we should list them, discuss them, and summarize them, and synthesize them, and pull out common features. And so we have, for example, representative Hillslopes. convergent, divergent slopes, upland and lowland, the different orders of slopes feeding into different order of streams, and then plus aspect on top of that. And then we can also divide a grid into drainage zones. For example, the equivalent cross sections idea or the bins of elevation zones according to the height and the distance above from the nearest drainage, and then further differentiate with aspect. And so this is a place we had a lot of good discussions and a lot of work has been done. And so we can summarize these practical approaches here and then maybe have a table and to describe pros and cons. And then the third line here, the relation with streams of different orders, and how do Hillslope and the rivers and streams exchange water. Rivers not just pull groundwater, rivers also dump water into the groundwater, especially in the arid, semi-arid regions where groundwater is recharged by stream leakage. And the floodplain processes, for example, we didn't have time to discuss, but I know that several people in the audience have given this a lot of thought. And so we need to have a discussion here as well. And critically important under section 3 is the covariance that Sean talked about, that Nate nicely addressed, and that Leho and Jim also talked about. And Martyn summarized. So this covariance among the topography, soil texture, soil depth, and the vegetation, this is something far more fundamental than just a practical approach to implement in models. This really tests our understanding of the Earth system. This tests the limits of our understanding of the Earth system, right? And how things vary, what caused what, and then feed back to another. So these things co-evolved through eons of time. And these are basic Earth science research questions as well, not just data analysis. And I hope that we all see that there is greater need to do this to really understand how these factors co-evolved through the Earth history, and not just a snapshot, and not just a noise in the data, and not just the practical sort of an annoyance. That we need to really look for structure, a fundamental structure of how things interact, the biotic and the abiotic aspects of the Earth system, the terrain system interact. Okay, so what kind of global analysis are needed? What are really the key questions here? I think this is not a whole lot of clear. We know some anecdotal evidence that things are related, but we really need to step out, look at the global picture. And the fourth section is what are the essential terrain analysis and available codes. So the section 2 and 3 talked about this global analysis already. And here we are, section 4, we'll talk about this again, but here we have a more practical need. We are looking at the existing methods and the codes to derive parameters related to Hillslope profiles and plan forms, and convergent, divergent, concave, convex, for example, and the weight functions, for example, and the height and or distance and both above nearest drainage, and covariance cluster analysis. And this is really a survey of our capabilities of doing this, given the scientific incentives from section 2, section 3, and what are really the essential analysis we must do. Oops. And then section 5. This is where a lot of people can contribute, and this is going forward. Beyond the very practical approaches we focus right now, the aspect and the elevation, what are the key research questions that both sides need to address? For example, subsurface heterogeneity, which is much discussed and which is really the biggest headache for hydrologists. We are obsessed with this, right? For good reasons, because it is so difficult problem. And we have this range of scales from macropores to geologic provinces to karst terrains, to volcanic terrains. And the vertical heterogeneity, it's not just exponential decrease in porosity and permeability. We know that is generally true at the geologic scales, at the kilometer and tens of kilometer scales, Earth crust to mantle to moho, these kind of scales, yes, the porosity permeability decrease at the exponential sort of a pattern monotonically. But in the surface, near surface material, this is not so. Someone earlier mentioned, I think David Chandler mentioned the regolith and the rock waters. This is one of the critical discoveries of the critic zone observatories, the rock moisture. Those are the immobile regolith, and those are immature sediments. They are in the middle, on their way to be broken down into sediments and soils. And they are large storages for water and often supplies the dry season in the Mediterranean, in the coastal ranges. So there are just all these problems, vertical changes in permeability, porosity. And so this is a section that we can identify at least what are the critical data analysis, what are the research that needs to be done to quantify the global land surface and near subsurface. What are the properties of materials? Can we stay with soil bedrock transition, or do we need some transition zones instead of a sharp contrast and no flow boundary? So all these questions need to be asked, and we need to have a place, have a voice for that, and this is section 5 is the place. And then again, the covariance among soil, among topography, among vegetation and the climate, and then not just soil and vegetation, also gradient. Topographic gradient is a major organizing principle for ecosystems, for climate. The early explorers like Humboldt, when he comes down from the Andes all the way down to the Peruvian Amazon, lowland Amazon elevation, and everything sorting along the elevation becomes very apparent. So this is the so-called soil katina concept. The geographers and soil scientists have been discussing for decades, for if not for centuries. And now we need to step out, look at this globally. What are the katina types in this global environment? And lastly, the ESM sensitivity. And Sean showed some really revealing pictures, very simple, just like Reynolds Creek, a whole world. We have 3 columns, and then just when we do this, it really brings out the seasonal climate, the transition climate, where ESM can potentially be very sensitive to this Hillslope hydrology and to water, energy, carbon, nutrient cycles are very sensitive to this kind of subgrid process representation. And so, but what Sean has shown is not the actual topography. So we really need to use the actual topography of the world and use actual geology, actual climate and the soil and the vegetation, and then turn on the carbon cycle and then nutrient cycle in CLM and look at the sensitivity to this. So this is some of the stuff I can think of, and there's a lot of room of everybody to supplement this. And so going forward, where do we do? What do we do? So where we are, and I want to have a very brief review for how this started. In January, CUAHSI sent out an open call for contributions to implement Hillslope hydrology ESMs. And then we solicited 2-page white papers, and the 16 groups contributed, and which tremendously helped us to crystallize on the ideas. So these are the ideas that helped us to organize those 5 webinars. And so we had those webinars in April and in May. Now going forward, by end of May, which means tomorrow, and I would like you to email me if you plan to contribute, if you believe that there are important issues or the current content outline I laid out there, if you have contributions to this synthesis paper, please email me, because I don't want to send out broad emails. I some people get really annoyed. So you have to tell me you want to be a part of this. And so, and I will create a Dropbox to put in the draft outline in there, and I will share with you. And only those of you who email me, and as many of you have sent in the 2-page white papers, and so if you want to stay on, you don't have to email me. If you send in the white papers, but you now want to withdraw, please email me so I don't keep bothering you. I would like you to do this as soon as possible. And then, through this month of June, and Martyn and I will produce a draft 1, and we'll put in the Dropbox. And then, so in the month of June, and please put in your edits. Please track change, and please put a new version with your initial in the file name, so we don't have multiple versions. And then Martyn and I will incorporate the edits as they come in. And then we will produce draft 1.1, 1.2, etc. And so I would like to ask you to read this paper led by Martyn in 2015. Improving the representation of hydrological processes, Earth system models. I think this is really important. If you have not had a chance to read this, please read this, because this is our synthesis paper 1. Now we're writing synthesis paper 2 with a more pragmatic and narrower scope. But we built onto synthesis paper 1. And paper 1 outlined the vision, the scientific motivation, the opportunities, the challenges, and a detailed review of major land models, how they do their hydrology, and the very important issue of benchmarking. How do we know we're better? And another important issue is to connect with the CZO, connect ESM with the CZO communities. So some of the issues, critical issues have been addressed here, and we're going to try to avoid repeating the content in this synthesis paper too. So that's why it's important for you to read this if you have not had a chance. And then, so our goal is by the end of July, we will have a draft 2 that have incorporated the first round of everybody's input. And then through the month of July, and your edit can be incorporated again, the second round of edit. And then we're going to produce draft 2.1, 2.2, etc. And our goal is by the end of August, we have a draft 3 that have incorporated 2 rounds of input from you. And then we can think about submission. And this is a time line that's pretty tight, but I think it's important for us to ride the momentum and then try to finish this, wrap this up before teaching starts, which will be so crazy. So that's what I have right now, and I'm open to questions now. Sorry, I just talked non-stop straight. Hello, is everybody still out there? Oops, I lost my screen, my control panel. I can't now. Liz, can you get me out of my screen share mode?
Yeah.
I lost my control panel, so I can't see the questions. Here we go. You can also unmute yourself, so we can you can talk instead of type. Instead of typing, that would save you some time, and we can really communicate more effectively. I understand that we have run over time. I apologize. Liz, do we have to quit, or can we go on to answer these questions, at least the ones that are in the comment box?
You can go on for at least until 12:30.
Okay, so I'm going to read David Chandler's. For the Reynolds Creek comparisons, how much sensitivity is there to Hillslope aspect? We have not done the comparison of aspect yet, David, and which is next thing to do, as Sean has outlined. Justin so far has done the convergence, the downslope lateral flow, and the next thing we hope to test the sensitivity is the aspect. And another question from David, under point 2, it is as important to consider cold, warm, hot transitions due to elevation as wet and dry climate. True, absolutely. Steve Lowhide, under point 2, you stress that you need thirsty plants and at least dry season water limitation for Hillslope hydrology to matter. I think it's also useful to recognize that the water storage capacity of the soils is also important in determining the extent to which these down-gradient ecosystems are dependent upon lateral transfers during low precipitation periods. True. Excellent point, Steve. And Steve Burgess comment, it would be beneficial to seek input from skilled senior colleagues. You are in, Steve. Some suggestions are John Shackey, Yuri Schmeyer, and okay, so Chris Milley is on. Chris Milley is actively involved in our synthesis. Okay, so yes. Okay, wow, this is a long name, long list of names. Okay, so Steve, we had an open call. And so everybody is welcome to participate. And if senior people don't want to, you know, if they, I don't know, I guess we can invite them, but we invited everybody. Okay, so David Chandler said we are still alive. Welcome to the webinar. So I'm so glad. We're so glad you guys participated and get involved. We sent out the open call many times, and this projects we sent out open call of AGU as well, and but through CUAHSI, and but you have to come to us. How do you test whether you adequately represent important processes at different ESM grid scales? Benchmarking is the key here. Yes, Krista, absolutely. And in the 2015 paper that Martyn led, there is a substantial discussion on benchmarking, multivariate, multi-scale, and the new ways ILAMS is also part of it. That paper does discuss this. So which is why I want to remind people to read that paper, because we don't want to repeat what's said there. And another...
Can I come quickly here, Ying?
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, so Krista actually has a paper in HES at the moment. It's still under review, which talks about benchmarking and evaluating competing approaches for hydrological modeling. So that paper would be worth reading as well. Great.
Can you, maybe when it's out, right, we can, when we write it, we should cite it at least if it's out. And so if you have, Krista, if you have it, can you, if you don't mind sharing it, can you, before publication, can you send it to us so that we can put it in the Dropbox folder?
Yeah, well, I can put it in there, Ying, because it's already available to everybody, seeing as it's HES.
That's right, HES, an open discussion, right? Okay. Yeah. You know, the literature that came out after 2015, and this included, should be considered. And if you see this literature that's not cited in the 2015 paper that makes an important point relevant, please put it in the Dropbox. Once I have the Dropbox set up, please put that paper, put those references in. Next question, also from Krista. A model benchmark consists of 3 components: a particular data set, a particular performance metric, and a particular reference value for that metric. I hope this is discussed, Krista, in the paper. Okay, more questions? Anyone, you can raise your hand as well. Well, if you don't want to ask questions here, please send me an email. And I would like to hear from each of you who plans to contribute. And then while you send me an email, you can also send your comments and suggestions. And if we have no more questions, ladies and gentlemen, I think we can conclude our webinar. And I want to thank again all the speakers and Liz for organizing and planning this webinar series for us, and for those of you who have asked great questions, and I hope to hear from all of you down the road. Thank you and goodbye.
All right, well, thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your day.